Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Egypt. It's already over 95 degrees, and breakfast, well, if you're lucky, it's bread and onions. Think you could survive in a single-room mud brick house with no privacy, no ventilation, and animals sharing your bed? Let's explore why daily life for the average Egyptian might have been too much for you to handle. Imagine this. It's sunrise in ancient Egypt. The air is already heavy with heat, and you've barely stirred from the mat you call a bed. Your first challenge? Getting dressed. On paper, it sounds easy, until you realize clothing wasn't just about modesty or looking sharp. What you put on could mean the difference between surviving the relentless desert climate or spending the day battling heat exhaustion. Here's the thing about Egyptian clothing. It was a survival tool, as essential as water. The heat was unforgiving, with temperatures soaring well over 100 degrees during the daytime. Egyptians mastered the art of choosing lightweight, breathable materials, mostly linen, which they crafted from the fibers of the flax plant. But here's where it gets tricky. Linen didn't come off a store shelf. It started as a labor-intensive process. Those long, fibrous stalks of flax had to be harvested by hand, softened, and carefully spun into threads. Weaving linen meant sitting at rudimentary looms for hours, guiding each strand to create fabric. And dyeing it? Good luck! The colorful adornments you see in museums today were achieved using natural pigments sourced from plants, insects, and minerals. No chemical shortcuts, no pre-dyed spools of thread, nothing. Imagine trying to recreate even a plain piece of fabric with your 21st century skill set. Most of us wouldn't even know where to start. And the labor doesn't stop there. Now you've got the fabric. What about the designs? Ancient Egyptians thrived in minimalism, not because it was fashionable, but because it was necessary. The common wardrobe consisted of simple, easy-to-wrap garments that kept the body cool while protecting it from the sun. For men, this often meant a kilt-like wrap secured at the waist. For women, it might be a sheath dress tied with straps. Sounds straightforward, right? Not so fast. Even tying these garments correctly required technique. Forget fumbling with elastic waistbands or Velcro. Without modern clothing tutorials or a tailor's handy expertise, most of us would fail the task before even stepping out the door. Now let's talk footwear. Sandals, made from braided plant fibers like papyrus or palm leaves, were absolutely essential. Without them, the scorching desert sands would scorch your feet in seconds. It's a sharp contrast to the shoes we barely think about today, often discarded in favor of bare feet when the weather's nice. But in ancient Egypt, foregoing footwear meant burning your soles or stepping on sharp rocks, not to mention the very real threat of scorpions lurking in the dust. And while we're on the subject of protection, poorly chosen garments could leave you completely vulnerable to the elements. Forget sunburn, you'd risk heat stroke, dehydration, and a very miserable existence trying to adapt to a world built for those who'd mastered their environment. Here's a vivid picture for you. Imagine tying together pieces of hand-woven linen into what barely resembles a toga, only to realize it's too loose and constantly slipping as you move. The fabric snags, the sun beats down, and the sandals on your feet feel flimsy on the hot ground. You're not comfortable, you're not functional, and every step outside is a trial. Clothing in ancient Egypt wasn't just a matter of preference. It was a full-blown skill that took years to master. Any modern human, with our pre-made clothes and fast fashion, would stick out like a sore thumb, not just because of ignorance, but because we'd likely give up halfway through weaving one thread. And don't forget, failure to dress correctly wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. The wrong attire could render you heat-stricken before lunchtime. Out here, you're not dressing to impress. You're dressing to endure. But here's the uncomfortable truth. All of this, crafting clothes, preparing footwear, knowing how to work with nature's unforgiving elements, was just the beginning of a daily routine. Modern comforts strip us of these skills completely. So you finally got dressed. Great. But now that the day is shifting into evening, there's a new challenge waiting for you. Darkness. Let's talk about what happens when the sun goes down. Picture this. The sun dips below the horizon, leaving everything around you submerged in darkness. The sky turns a deep blue, then black, and you realize just how quiet it feels when there are no streetlights, no glowing phone screens, and no hum of electricity in the background. In ancient Egypt, when the sun set, it wasn't just the end of the day, it was the end of most activity. And if you think a simple oil lamp could completely solve that problem, think again. Life after dark was dictated by one simple fact: light was hard to come by. Ancient Egyptians mainly relied on clay oil lamps or candles to illuminate their homes. These weren't the plug-and-play lamps we know today. Oil lamps required fuel, typically animal fat or vegetable oils, and wicks made of reeds or flax. Any of this might seem straightforward until you think about sourcing those materials by hand. Animal fat wasn't as easily available for the average Egyptian as a trip to the butcher. A single lamp burning through the night could consume resources you'd otherwise need for cooking or bartering. Candles weren't much better. They were expensive and labor-intensive to make, which made them a luxury, not a guaranteed amenity for everyone. Most households had to ration light carefully, saving lamps and candles for specific tasks that couldn't wait until dawn. And even with light sources in use, the risks didn't exactly make torchlight a comforting solution. Homes in ancient Egypt were often made of sun-dried mud bricks, a material that was practical in the desert heat, but dangerously flammable. Lighting an oil lamp or candle inside these compact, often cramped homes wasn't just inconvenient, but outright hazardous. One clumsy move or an untended flame, and the house could go up in smoke. Even minor accidents with open flames were catastrophic, and with windows being small or non-existent to block the heat of the day, smoke wouldn't exactly clear out quickly either. But what might surprise you most isn't the relative inconvenience of lighting, it's how dependent we've become on the modern ability to stretch time. Today, we live completely independent of the sun. Electricity lets us work, socialize, and relax around the clock. In ancient Egypt, your schedule revolved entirely around daylight. Once night fell, productivity slowed to a crawl. Reading, crafting, or even sewing became infinitely harder by the dim glow of a single lamp. As a result, tasks requiring precision were either saved for daylight or abandoned altogether. The night was for resting, or enduring depending on how keenly you felt the limits brought on by darkness. No artificial light also meant no refrigeration. Without it, food storage was a constant concern. Most Egyptians relied on preservation methods like drying or salting, especially for meat and fish. Some households stored food underground to keep it cool. But once the sun disappeared, managing your supplies became a race against time and spoilage. Fancy grabbing a drink in the middle of the night? That involved fumbling around in pitch-black conditions, with nothing but a flickering flame in your hand. And that's assuming you even had water stored somewhere safe from contamination or pests. Life after sundown wasn't just inconvenient, it was risky. In the darkness, your world also felt smaller. With no glowing cityscapes or even a neighbor's porch light to break the pitch-black silence, nighttime could feel isolating. Psychological impacts were unavoidable. You'd adjust your expectations, knowing you couldn't physically or mentally sustain the level of activity modern life stretches into the late hours. And outside your hut? Let's put it this way. Nothing good roamed out there after dark. Whether it was wildlife, thieves, or just a creeping sense of vulnerability, the lack of light made every sound sharper and every shadow feel like a danger. So, how would you spend your evenings? Picture sitting in near total darkness, huddled close to family, with a small flame cutting through the gloom. You'd eat early, move carefully, and think twice about taking unnecessary steps after sundown. Light shaped survival strategies, dictated routines, and reminded ancient Egyptians where their limits truly lay. For modern humans used to a world that never really sleeps, that kind of existence would feel like being trapped in a cage, locked by the natural rhythm of the sun. But just as darkness affected how people lived their nights, there was another, ever-present danger that no amount of torches could fully protect you from: disease. Let's talk about how your immune system would have held up. Or rather, wouldn't have. Think you're healthy. In ancient Egypt, your immune system would have been in for the fight of its life. Disease wasn't just a possibility back then. It was an inevitable part of daily existence. On top of the brutal climate and relentless physical labor, you'd also face an invisible enemy: pathogens. Malaria, tuberculosis, and parasitic infections like schistosomiasis were everywhere, thriving in the heat and poor sanitation. These weren't occasional outbreaks. They were constant threats to survival. Your best defenses today, vaccines, antibiotics, clean running water, just didn't exist. And without them, your body wouldn't stand much chance. Let's start with the Nile. You'd think a river that gave life to an entire civilization would be your saving grace, but it wasn't that simple. Sure, the Nile was essential for farming, drinking, and bathing, but it was also a breeding ground for deadly diseases. People relied on it for everything, but waste went straight into the water. Human waste, animal waste, and runoff from fields alike. Drinking from it without boiling or treating it? A gamble with severe consequences. Parasites like those causing schistosomiasis thrived here, infecting countless Egyptians. The disease didn't just make you sick. It left you chronically weak, with complications like liver damage, organ scarring, and constant fatigue. Imagine going about your already grueling day with an illness draining what little energy you had left. But water wasn't the only hazard. Living conditions didn't help either. In homes often shared with livestock, close contact with animals meant an increased risk of zoonotic diseases, those transmitted from animals to humans. Fleas, lice, and rodents were everywhere, spreading bacteria and other infections. Modern sanitation systems like plumbing and garbage collection were a fantasy. Waste often ended up in open pits or thrown into the environment, creating perfect conditions for diseases to spread among humans. Adding to the misery, populous cities had very little in the way of hygiene practices. If you think catching a cold is frustrating, imagine living surrounded by the risk of tuberculosis or some other respiratory disease without so much as a tissue. And when illnesses hit, and they always did, how were they treated? Today, you might head to the doctor where a quick antibiotic prescription or a vaccine protects you. Ancient Egyptians didn't have that luxury. They had rudimentary medical practices, most of which leaned heavily on herbal remedies and spiritual rituals. The medical knowledge they did have came from observation, trial, and error. Think poultices made from bread mold or attempts to heal wounds using honey. Now, as impressive as it is that honey can kill bacteria, it wasn't exactly a foolproof solution for infections. Many treatments combined herbs with prayers or incantations, as it was believed many illnesses were caused by spirits or angry gods. As for surgery, if the illness or injury didn't finish you off, the infection afterward probably would. What about those who avoided illness? They still faced staggering odds. High infant mortality rates meant many children didn't make it past early infancy, and for those who did, the average lifespan was only about 35 years. People measured their lives not in decades but in seasons, surviving one harsh summer, one challenging harvest at a time. The absence of vaccines meant that diseases like smallpox, which could wipe out entire families, were always lurking in the background. Without antibiotics, even minor infections from a scrape or blister could turn deadly. And while Egyptians were highly resourceful, using plants and careful observation to develop treatments, there were limits to what they could achieve without microscopes, sterilization, or an understanding of germs. Here's a thought. Imagine scooping a drink of water from the Nile after a long day in the fields. Thirsty and needing to cool down. Within days, your stomach would be in agony, and you'd likely be feverish and weak. The cause? Contaminated water, riddled with parasites or bacteria. Just another fact of life in ancient Egypt. You'd face the very real possibility of dying from what you assumed was helping you survive. And unlike now, there was no emergency room, no saline IV, no antibiotics, just the hope that your body could somehow fight it off. Disease wasn't just a personal tragedy for the Egyptians, it shaped every part of their world, from how they ate and worked to how they prayed. Survival revolved around avoiding or battling the next inevitable illness. Compared to ancient pathogens, the worst flu of modern life might start to feel like a blessing. But before you start counting the diseases you'd dodge in a time machine, take a second to think about the reality of leaving behind modern comforts. How would you handle life without them? Because disease wasn't the only challenge, ancient Egypt would throw at you. Despite every hardship, the ancient Egyptians found ways to endure. They transformed the unforgiving Nile into a lifeline, developed homes that balanced the extremes of heat and cold, and worked tirelessly to preserve food and sustain their families. In many ways, their resourcefulness shines even brighter when compared to how heavily we depend on modern comforts to avoid life's challenges. Think about it. What would happen if those conveniences were stripped away tomorrow? Could you adapt? Or would that world break you? Let us know in the comments how you'd handle it. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this dive into the past.